Yeah, so this is just going to be somewhat a little bit of updated commentary on the South African, uh, on diagnosing the core problem of the current South African disaster or crisis of sort of this kind of rioting. I mean, it's there are a lot of elements to this, but I mean that make it. I mean, it could really be questioned if this would have happened if we had had COVID-19. If there was no COVID-19 in existence, if we didn't have lockdowns, I mean, this happened in the middle of the beginning of a new lockdown cycle. Perhaps even with the old lockdown cycles, if there wasn't a new lockdown cycle, with the kind of fatigue and the kind of mental, sort of shade that puts, sort of people are more on edge and things like that. So, even if we didn't have the latest lockdown cycle, just the earlier ones might have precipitated this kind of opportunistic, sort of. So there are a lot of elements happening here. I mean, first of all, there's the overt incitement uh, for this kind of racial politics and ethnic tribalism and things like that, which has been in a broader way, apart from sort of the Zulu ethnic nationalism and sort of the Zulu tribalism, but the broader, let's say, black nationalism, which has been used for a long time now to insulate the ANC from the consequences of its own bad policy. That kind of racialist rhetoric, and in some sense, what we're now is we're reaping the harvest of that style of politics, which has continually degraded and depended on a kind of democratic deficit of low information voters that just get that indulge in the kind of the racial narrative and the racial scapegoating. And so it's interesting to see that schism or that sort of contradiction, how the ANC is now within itself, because of its political necessity of needing to at least ostensibly pretend to be reforming itself, pretend to be, sort of cracking down on corruption. And so it goes after a part of itself, perhaps the more corrupt wing of the party, but there's enough corrupt apparatus within the party, there's enough patronage within the party that it probably has set up a Russian-style oligarchy of, sort of political elites and those connected with political elites to form a kind of oligarchy and kleptocracy, in fact. And so how that ever gets dismantled without a change of government is, a bit. Uh, I don't see it as being really viable or possible. Ramaphosa himself, the president himself, is. I mean, you could say that he has to tactically pick and choose his battles, and he's, maybe over the long haul he would do it, but in the meantime, he is playing. He's sitting on certain fences, on certain ideological fences. He has indulged himself in this toxic racialist narrative and this, kind of toxic race baiting, because that is or has been the main staple of the glue holding the ANC together. Because without a scapegoat, without a common enemy, without an outgroup to blame, you can't facilitate, this form of pseudo transformation and pseudo development agenda, which empowers tokens, which empowers, sort of, um, you know, uh, black ownership in corporations. That when you get these huge tenders, the from the government, their price can be inflated, um, because their black ownership credentials, shares have been given to someone, and that someone is always sort of politically connected. And so, and uh, I've got another recording where I talk about, how this essentially also the mandates that government imposes on the private sector have essentially hollowed out the genuine, authentic functioning of any kind of development or growth is simply impossible with this kind of toxic racial um, disruption of the labor market, but also of just contracts and things like that, that the waste um, that gets funneled into these kleptocrats, these, sort of uh, just make the state so fundamentally, anyway, the loss of efficiency, and when we have pragmatic things that need to be invested in, and we're basically wasting money on black billionaires and millionaires, as sort of important tokens, because that's what this style of black economic empowerment focuses on. It doesn't focus on the disadvantage, it focuses on the superficial credential of just being black. And so there's no fundamental empowerment involved in how this kind of pseudo transformation takes place. And this legislation should have been constitutionally challenged and proven to be anti-constitutional, but the Constitutional Court has stopped doing its proper role. It doesn't actually use the limitations clause to test these disgusting pieces of legislation, like the Promotion of Equality Act, because it would not pass muster. And so instead they invented this disgusting contortion of the South African legal system. They invented something called a governmental prerogative, so that they don't have to do their job, and they don't have to say, is this limitation of fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights, is it worth it's kind of disgusting, just how much the judiciary has warped itself in order to facilitate the corruption of the state. And I would argue that it's that basically unprincipled moral corruption and betrayal of non-racialism, the courts not doing their role, which has facilitated the state corruption. But anyway, and it's done so in the context of this ever-increasing background of racialized politics and racial nationalism. And now we have, let's say, a more particular sort of ethnic tribalism that is challenging, sort of the ANC hegemony, or at least the kind of the cultural formula that their political rhetoric sort of is all hinged on. So it's an interesting contradiction to see. The problem is that even if this contradiction gets resolved, the deeper problem of the fact that we don't have a functioning judiciary, in that it has already betrayed non-racialism, it doesn't safeguard the individual citizen and actually secure what is real social justice for the individual. Instead, it has bought into this toxic reinterpretation of the Constitution in this very racialist, disgusting, sort of racial chauvinism, and and this relativistic narrative, sort of that lends credence to demagoguery and to the kinds of corrupt politics, and I mean this in terms of the kind of corrupt politics that you get out of the mouth of Tito Mboweni and Cyril Ramaphosa themselves, often drum up this kind of toxic racialist narrative and relativism. That kind of ethical, principled line has already been blurred to the point at which that you can facilitate an endless amounts of corruption which are undetectable, which should have been ruled out by the courts. The regulation that enforces this kind of disgusting racial consciousness, that you have to count people's skin color when you're working out how to do business with someone, is not how affirmative action and development can actually function in a non-racial way. And so we have destroyed the edifice of a non-racial society. We have trodden on and destroyed those principles, and now finally it has manifested as a contradiction within the ANC's sort of ruling formula. So that is an interesting development in itself, but they don't really have the moral standing to quell this kind of problem. I mean, for the reasons that I've just kind of outlined, but also for the reason that the ANC itself operates and functions from a kind of continual looting. So they don't really have the moral standing to tell other people not to go looting. So it is interesting. I mean, I if this political crisis can be solved, and this crisis on the ground in the areas that are affected can be solved, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't help in the long term, as far as I can see. Even if Cyril Ramaphosa can deal with the more toxic wing of his own party, it's still going to be a kind of some version of a kleptocracy is going to remain. And yeah, so it remains to be seen if maybe there can be some kind of electoral revolution where people will actually divest from the ANC and invest into other parties. But there's still going to be a large constituency for the kind of toxic racial politics, and they have already sort of committed themselves to having a program of changing the constitution to facilitate more radical sort of racial revenge and redistribution. Um, with this kind of reinterpretation of the practice of equality and this reinterpretation of social justice to, quite ironically, facilitate unaccountable politics, as we have been devastated by over last sort of 20 years at a certain gradient scale of exacerbation. So yeah, I don't know. And I do wonder if there's certain things that seem to happen. There are a lot of in the Western Cape. There are a lot of parties that are the Cape Coloured Congress, which has been around for a while, but also now the Patriotic Alliance. Um, uh, are these new racial, um, in some sense they are made in the style of the EFF racialist ANC style of politics. They say that we need parties that hold racial interests, so that we can have our seat around the table and we can get our cut of the of the sort of the redistribution from the ideological scapegoat. And I wonder how much of that kind of style of politics is perhaps not being funded or supported to some degree from the ANC as a way to sort of further hard boil, sort of the democracy frog, because it does seem that as soon as you indulge in this kind of racial politics, you don't get, you actually make it impossible to have a democratically literate society, because the things that are being spoken about, how stories are being framed, are, they don't inform a liberal democratic electorate. They are literally talking about just relativistic narratives, and the kind of the weird social psychological filter of reality in which everything gets cast as this sort of morality play between these ethnic entities. Are the only, that's the vision of politics that has been set up, and it's obviously, it is a precursor to a very debased political, very unaccountable politics. You can't sort of ever, your whole society gets captured, because essentially culture becomes one of, let's say, the manufactured products of the political sphere, and politics drives your culture, and you're always plied with this disgusting kind of ideology that's always trying to, sort of whip you up into, watching for the out group, and you know, the necessity to sort of um, to have this kind of automatic trust, and not to worry, and just sort of the credentials of your leadership are about their loyalty and not about, particular policy matters, or the only way that policy is judged is how chauvinistic it is, how redistributive it is, how, um, how much it's willing to sort of uh, uh, take revenge on some kind of outgroup or scapegoat, to sort of to prove its veracity in terms of how much it understands the pain and the, whatever the sort of the relativistic narrative is, that everything is about crafting a kind of hysterical moral emergency. And yeah, and we've really been subjected to that as a country for so long now that I think that, in some sense, to even, you know, at some point earlier, you would have hoped that responsible journalism would have even blamed the electorate themselves. Well, if you don't like how government is functioning, at some point you get the government that you vote for, and and you fundamentally get the government that you deserve. But that sort of basic democratic literacy has been barred, just as school textbooks were not delivered to rural schools in the Eastern Cape, because there is, in some sense, it's part of the ANC ruling strategy to have low information voters and to have a secure voting bloc that is just fed, this kind of ethnic, racial relativism and racial chauvinism, and the promises of revolution and sort of extracting revenge. And so you have a kind of a self disempowerment, which is part of the project, a kind of a psychological infantilism, and that we are dealing with the effects of this. Um, it's funny that apartheid has been labeled a crime against humanity, but there is absolutely no accountability from journalism, from the media, in terms of analyzing ANC policy and judging it, in any of and judging what's happening on the ground. It's only the talking points of the racial relativism, and that the whole the whole framework of an open liberal democracy has been subverted, and uh, uh, has been going through this process of sort of changing the goalposts in some sense into a kind of um, the kind of the weird kind of emotional argument of, well, if something is bad, it's always somebody else's fault. Never looking at pragmatically that uh, if somebody is stable and somebody else is impoverished, within the same border, within the same country, somehow the rich person has actually caused the deficit or something like that. It's that weird kind of emotional logic, which is, an oversimplified, sort of reduction of some kind of sociology. You just look at everything through the through the lens of disparity, and inequality is the cause of deprivation, not the quality of governance and the lack of planning, and sort of the efficacy of those plans and the efficacy of actually implementing things and having the right policy. All of those things are essentially, and because we have had no interest in democratic literacy, at least in terms of the function of the media and journalism, because they've leaned into this kind of narrative peddling of this oversimplification, where they have been part of corrupting the corrupting the democracy. I mean, you could say it's not. Well, that they were propagandized themselves by the universities that had these race and gender studies. This kind of this updated Nazi philosophy, this totalitarian, view of looking at society like, um, you know, it very much is like Aryan studies, in that, instead of inheriting genetic superiority, you kind of inherit a moral superiority from the system, from your place in the system. It's very mytho- it's very oversimplified. It's just like the mythology of blood and soil. It just has it's it's just as esoteric. I would argue it's just as disconnected and delusional, and it is so committed to its own self insulation of judging itself. That you can't even criticize it. You can't try to bring in common facts and basic facts that everyone can agree on, and um, common standards of values and ethics. It's all based on this very strict relativism. No, no, no. You can't even understand the pain of the black identity and the black lived experience. It's fundamentally cocooned in its own reality tunnel so that it can indulge in the psychopathy by two ways: by saying that, well, we need to take and redistribute, and we need to and we need you to understand that the damage that has been wrought means that no one can stand in our way. This is a moral emergency, and you know that is a form of political grift that is so toxic, because you can't ever have um, you can't have a proper debate about an issue. You can't look at real alternatives. You can't look at what's actually going on. You have to put on these ideological blinders. You have to filter reality. You have to cherry pick your facts. You have to just look at these strange statistics that have no moral, ethical principles attached to them, but somehow, well, just inequality. If we just tackle inequality, but we don't care about, any kind of principle, or that is where we are. We've thrown away the law. We've thrown away social justice, in the real social justice. We've thrown away the real constitution and non-racialism, and that moral corruption has facilitated this corruption that we sit with. And the sad thing is that if this current chaos goes away, we're still going to have that institutionalized corruption of the governmental prerogative. We're still going to have a state that has betrayed and murdered its own constitution. And the real question is, can it be resurrected? And that's not even on the table. That's not even in the political. I mean, this complaint that I'm making, there is no mention of it. We are so diverted from this basic course correction that needs to happen, that we're sort of on tertiary, subs. We're in some kind of subsidiary issue here about law and order as a secondary consequence of the toxicity of the kind of institutionalized corruption that the state has been wedded to and hinged on operating from. Anyway, okay, I've pontificated about this issue enough, I guess. And I mean, I don't know how we fix the legal system. You're going to have to sort of impeach these judges, or you're going to have some kind of have to have a radical. You're going to have to need a new constitutional court, and that's certainly not on the table, not unless you have some kind of succession from South Africa, and some territory can actually create a new constitutional court that doesn't betray and murder the constitution. Um, but yeah, it's sad that the Constitution really is the solution to these issues on paper. Uh, I mean, I say that, but that they would have prevented these sorts of issues. I mean, perhaps you could say that there are enough people in the country that just they fundamentally repudiate the Constitution. They don't value it. It's meaningless to them. It's just and they wanted to have it changed anyway to facilitate more of the toxic racialism, and more of that kind of unaccountable political grifting. And I mean, maybe it is true that the territory of the country does need to change in order to. You can't share a society with people where there isn't a basic consensus on certain basic values. And it's slightly confused because the ANC sometimes even says things about non-racialism, but it's utter smoke and mirrors. It's literally just window dressing for a macabre sort of parody. Uh, and the extent to which the ANC is trying to reform itself, it's the scope within which it's trying to curtail its own excesses is quite frankly, it's just not principled enough. It's not ethical enough. It's and I think already we might have too much of a kind of oligarchy state to facilitate any kind of meaningful uh, improvement. So in the face of that kind of, I mean, people have been seeing the writing on the wall for a long time that sort of the deterioration and the the constant loss of state capacity and I mean, we do certainly need different political leaders in power um, on the in the national sphere. But I'm afraid that there's so much of the toxic racialist element now. I don't know if, especially without the judiciary making the clear lines that need to be made in order to limit and curb the flagrant abuse of constitutional rights of the individual citizen. The lack of the willingness for the judiciary to use the limitations clause against or to test um, the value of regulations like the Promotion of Equality Act um, that have literally turned the Constitution inside out and destroyed it. But yeah, I mean, so that's the kind of the ideological quagmire that we're sort of sitting in, and no one, as far as I can see, is sort of dealing with it. I mean, the DA is dealing with it as a political choice. Well, if you need to elect a government that has a different interpretation of the Constitution. I do think it. I don't think this should have been a political debate. I think that people should have gone to court, and people should have said, well, if the court is not willing to defend the Constitution, then it's not fulfilling its constitutional duty, and we need to make a rebel court. We need to make a rebel constitutional court, or something like that. Um, I know. I see the need to have a judicial revolution in South Africa to get rid of the institutionalized corruption. Um, that is how you sort of clean things up, I would say. But uh, the extent to which that the country is politically captured and that there is an electorate that votes for this corrupt government, because essentially they couldn't care less. They don't care about the constitution. They don't care about these issues. They just care about a kind of racial nationalism. That is a political reality that just has to sort of be dealt with practically. And I think that the way to practically deal with that is to divide the territory of the country to some degree. If the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal should maybe be their own country, and they can do as they please within their borders, and there's certainly enough resources and things within them for them to play with. But usually the kind of toxic racialist politics always turns into some kind of expansionary opportunism at some point, because when they ruin things themselves, they need to go to war with somebody else. Um, it's how the kind of the ideology grievance works. Is they always outscale any hint of doubt, any worm of doubt, by just sort of escalating their grievances and agitating to some higher sort of resolution in the horizon, of the means will justify the end. They're always doubling down in this Ponzi scheme, that they can always blame things, and certainly the history in this country has helped to facilitate that, and no one is looking at the recent history. It's a very strange kind of hypocrisy that we can blame. Somehow the only history that matters in South Africa is the history before 1994. Is a bit ridiculous. The lack of ownership and political accountability has essentially rendered our democracy a farce to a large extent. But I would argue that journalism has not helped. Journalism has not blamed the electorate to some degree, and I think that without that kind of blame, you actually don't. You are complicit in sort of the indignity. You're almost sort of projecting a kind of fundamental denigration onto people by not holding them accountable for being the electorate of a country. I mean, I guess the one province that is exempt from this is the Western Cape, as the Western Cape has never supported an ANC majority in any election. But each other province, there's if you want, if you fought for democracy and you believe in democracy, you have to say the people deserve the government that they get in a democracy, and this is a democracy. And I would say that the suppression of democratic literacy is certainly an issue here, and the kinds of ways in which KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape has got this horrible alliance between sort of politics and traditional leadership, which it's interesting because a lot of the racial nationalists, they try to actually blame this on colonialism. It's funny that they can't actually rail against anything unless they can kind of project it onto an ideological scapegoat. They can't actually just deal with anything. They can't take responsibility for everything. The only way to fight it is to make sort of identitarian propaganda around it. It's quite funny. Because that level of politics will never be a functioning open liberal democracy, which is, I mean, it's interesting because that is a kind of component of the identitarian rhetoric. Is they have some kind of pretense to expansion of openness and possibility, but sort of in focusing on the relativism and the psychopath and the kind of and the psychopathic sort of storytelling um, of victims of the system, and that we have to take on their perspective of the narrative and vindicate their perspective of the narrative. Never mind that they're creating disgusting tools for unaccountable politics and sort of never-ending cycles of sort of inception into the most disempowering kind of propaganda, um, in which you can't even do anything about anything unless you can project it onto the scapegoat. Um, and so it is, I must say, slightly interesting to see the chickens come home to roost in terms of how the ANC has mismanaged um, the political uh, or that their style of hegemony is now fracturing into a more tribal, ethnocentric, sort of identitarian relativism. Um, and it's doing so on a scale which is obviously corrupt. Sort of you have a former president that was part of state corruption, was part of such a disastrous time in South African history. So obviously corrupt, and people willing, well, some people willing to probably strategically create a lot of damage so as to show their loyalty to the radical economic faction, radical economic transformation faction of the ANC, which is the much more corrupt wing of the party, um, but I would argue not even that much more corrupt. That the thing is that the radical economic transformation wing are willing to do a lot of things like completely, like put in laws which are obviously there to facilitate corruption. Whereas supposedly, the ANC is still trying to change the constitution so that their government officials can take whatever property they so wish to take for the interests of the state, and sort of turn us into a more obvious sort of banana republic. Um, it's almost it's a sad joke, how they are trying to bring in legislation and change the constitution to facilitate the kind of expropriation mechanisms that they want to operate. Is it's like a full-blown sort of socialistic state socialism. That the lack of capacity in the state can then be fixed by a State Department just sequestering property for the interests of the state. Right? It's these disgustingly vague criteria, and in some sense, there's no compunction for the state to actually have to conserve its own efficacy. The more pathetic the state is, the more radically it can just take things. Then, it's fundamentally hinged on its own, sort of lack of responsibility. It's sick. There's something fundamentally, uh, it's I can't think of the pejorative word, but it's sort of it's deeply deranged. It's deeply unhinged. Um, it has this kind of sympathy extraction, psychopathic, sadistically edged, sort of grift. Sort of it's designed for that kind of disgusting demagoguery that you see from Julius Malema all the time. Which is that half the time you talk about the you you talk about some horrible condition, and how it's hurting the identity and the indignity of the identity, that and so then that calls for the justification of whatever means necessary. Never mind that you're creating those conditions. That you're not helping those conditions. You're just facilitating unaccountable political influence and control over more and more resources. All the while, the whole sort of political sphere has completely displaced the judiciary. I mean, you can see this in the in the compensation without the expropriation without compensation draft bills, that it's so fundamentally it's antithetical to even having a judiciary as a branch of government. It's so essentially invested into the governmental prerogative. It sort of it's it that essentially the governmental prerogative becomes the ultimate light of truth. It becomes the ultimate sort of absolute relativism. And the courts have I think been complicit in this, because the law has the proposed regulation has developed around this weakness that the courts have essentially laid out for it, and they have abrogated their duty to the law, to the supreme law of the Constitution. Yeah, so I mean, for me, this is all about the moral corruption that has led to the state corruption, and now we are seeing elements of that. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself at this point, but I'm just upset that no one with this message that I'm this argument that I'm making is prominent and vocal, because I think that this is the lens that you have to see the issue from, and if you don't diagnose this as being the core of the problem, then you I don't think you have the proper criteria to judge, what a course correction is, what sort of improvement is, or what, you're just dealing in degrees of sort of fudged, or other forms of compromised, sort of subsistence or something like that. And I mean, that was something that I heard another commentator speak about, that you do need to have some sense of hope as to what are we holding out for, what are we hoping things to resolve towards. And I think that we've just completely lost, or we have lost the Constitution. We have lost the concept of justice. It has fallen into this dirty and disgusting political racket of identity, identity politics demagogues, and it's so useful at creating unaccountable politics, and we have suffered from that. And we've gone down so far in that rabbit hole that we've been so diverted from, let's say, common standards and common sense and pragmatism and efficacy that uh, I think we've kind of we've lost, and I'm talking generally as a society, um, we've lost sight of even the goalposts. You know, we can't even we're not on the field. We're on some, you know, surreal, you know, imaginary thing that has been dreamt up by black racialists, by black nationalists, and essentially black fascists that have encroached and subverted and eventually, you know, I mean, I guess you could say that they're, in the first place, they're corrupt. Um, and in the second place, they developed this black fascism essentially in order to insulate that corruption. But it amounts to the same thing, especially when you're dealing with enough of the electorate on the ground that has now an appetite for this kind of black fascistic. Um, I mean, the EFF is pure proof of that. If you look at the numbers that support the EFF, I mean, uh, it's. I mean, this is the Nazi Party. There's absolutely no difference in quality of moral, um, philosophical, political consciousness between the Nazi Party and the EFF. And the EFF are have the exact same mentality as a large section of the ANC. And that is the only glue that holds them together uh, at this point, as well. So, you know, under those sorts of conditions, it's hard to see what. I think there's just going to be more of a devolution, or more of a deterioration. Um, Hopefully, I just hope that people will get the right message. They will get they will not just look at the surface, you know, sort of issues. They will try to diagnose them and not just give superficial reasons as to what brought this about. This was a cynical government that invested in its own democratic deficit in order to insulate itself and create a toxic politics. But at the same time, the biggest crime is that the law itself, the supreme law, the Constitution, was gutted, was betrayed, was twisted, was reinterpreted by racialist uh, ideologues